Good afternoon, and you're very welcome to Griffith College for the launch of Griff-FM, and we're joined by a great panel of guests. We're going to be speaking with Eoin McDevitt from Second Captains a little bit later on, but first, our panel joining us here today is Henry McKean, Bobby Kerr and Dr. Gavin Jennings. Could you all give them a round of applause? Thanks for coming in to us. Now, what we're going to do in this section is we're going to talk about the respective careers of our three guests who have joined us. So, seeing as Henry is sitting beside me, I'll start with Henry. Henry, tell us a little bit about your background. You were actually a student in Griffith College many years ago.
Yes, I went to Griffith College 1997. Then I went to Australia, came back, and I did a diploma. Then I did a degree back in 1997 when I suppose the internet was starting and the computers were really big. We didn't have smartphones. Minidisc was how we used to edit stuff on radio.
You were just past reel-to-reel and into minidisc.
Yeah, reel-to-reel was being phased out, and we actually had Griff-FM in the basement of where the bar is now. It was an old stables converted.
That's right. Really,
and it probably wasn't a very suitable room. I think it was an old kitchen, so it had tiles. So the sound
small,
bounced all over the place.
Really small,
but it was small, and it was great fun. And like even Mark Simpson, who's now the Right Hook producer, he was producing the then breakfast program, and I gave him a mini disc which I'd recorded in Australia, and there was lots of swearing on it, and lots of swearing, and he didn't check the tape before it went to broadcast, and I went out, and can we swear?
You swear away.
Tits, willy, bum, but much worse than that, like really strong swear words, and it was a real...
Don't go for any of those ones, Henry.
Learning for all of us, because we realised, hang on a second, you've got to listen to stuff before it goes to air. So, and Griff-FM was a great way for me to get into radio, because I realised, hang on a second, you can make money out of this. Let's do this.
Yeah, and you went travelling and you came back with hundreds of hours of audio.
I did. I had loads. I had everything from Cambodia landmines to Australian dingoes, because around the time, this is not funny, a dingo killed a child on an island. So I went away and just got some stuff.
Okay, so after you finished up here, what was your career progression then from then on?
I suppose, and I suppose I'll go back to the reason why I got into radio. Another reason is was BBC Radio 2, because on BBC Radio 1 I used to live in the UK and I moved here in 1990, and I just thought, wow, what a brilliant way. So moved to Ireland, and then I actually called you. I called you, John, when I finished. You were in Newstalk at the time. And I rang the office, and I met a guy called Pete Lunn, who used to work with BBC's Newsnight, and he was our editor, and he kept saying, Henry, I've nothing. You can't work with us. You just can't. So I kept ringing. Eventually you picked up, and you said, come in. And I've been there ever since.
Yeah, because we were just desperate looking for someone at that stage, So when you were working with me, you were on the Late Night Live show at that time. I sent you out to do different assignments and so forth. I think one of them was I sent you to a gentleman's club.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Yeah, I think I did go to a gentleman's club, and you asked me to do some really difficult things. And I think the first thing you asked me to do was Bloomsday, actually. Mm-hmm. And I was like, I don't know much about James Joyce. I haven't read Ulysses. And then I realized, and I'm sure everyone else here on the panel, sometimes you don't really know much about the subject, but you can get through it, and I just about did that day, but you did give me some very tough assignments to start me out.
And the way we worked it was, the Vox Pop is usually a short format Vox. You're usually looking at a minute to 2 minutes, but I wanted to do things just a little bit differently, so yes. I gave you the chance to do longer reports.
Yeah, you did. You would give me, like in radio, and of course it might differ on Morning Ireland or even with Bobby, but like most of the time it's 4 items an hour. You guys, it might be 8 items. So and there's 4 ad breaks in an hour, or 3 ad breaks but 4 slots. So you'd give me a slot, so that would last anywhere between 8 and 9 minutes. So
and then you had to fill it, though.
That was something decent that people would want to listen to.
And it's you're still doing the same type of material, really. You do long form reports.
I still do. I still, like today's report was on unemployed men and how they can't get work and how difficult it is for them. So, and I was working on something with Mary Mitchell O'Connor, Fine Gael Daneri, trying to keep her seat TD, and this morning, so I came into the office, went into a meeting, and I didn't have long to do it, but sometimes in radio you can get lucky and you can meet some really interesting people, and then other times you can get really unlucky and meet boring people. And there's no exact science about it, obviously.
Yeah, but Henry, I would say that you have a certain
Yeah.
way about you and a certain charm that you get people to, tell stories that they mightn't tell to other people.
Well, no, I mean, people have said that before. People have said, people would open up to me, but they don't always. Like, sometimes...
That's just the stuff that we hear on air.
Some people go, you have a magic formula, but I don't. Like, sometimes you're relying completely on the people you meet, and just like people on the panel, you're as good as your last guest, and you're as good as the person you're talking to, because it's about telling their story. It's not really about you. Your job is just to facilitate and get them to say something interesting.
But I have heard reports that you've done with people who had been in prison, so former convicts, people with drug problems, homeless issues, and you do get them to tell amazing stories. So what advice would you give to students here about getting those really strong stories and those personal stories?
I'm looking around the room here, and there's some really bright people. I don't know if they're bright; they just look bright. But and they're from all over the world, and they're from everywhere. They're from Ireland, they're from Europe, and they're from you name it. And they've got to be determined, and they will face a lot of rejection. And they will face... That's what it's about, though. You said there, you have to be determined. You can't give up. I mean, it's very easy to give up and going into PR. No offence to people who are in PR in the room, sorry. But we do have some PR students in here, actually. And there's nothing, PR is great, and without PR, radio stations need them too. But you just got to keep on going. Would you say that you need to be tenacious? You have to keep pushing in this industry to make it, to do well in the industry? You do. I mean, there are days, like I was saying there earlier, I felt I was really frustrated with somebody in the office just because of layers of nonsense, bureaucracy and personalities. Someone said, why wasn't I told about this? And I'm like, I don't know, it's not my problem. Like, my problem is to go and make radio, and that's your problem. So you do face difficult people, difficult personalities, and also radio does attract... Sometimes it attracts evil people. Evil people. Okay, all right. Well, there are difficult people. There are difficult people sometimes in the business. Well, we will open up the discussion and we'll talk about working with program teams and so forth. But I want to get the insight from Bobby and Gavin before we get into more generalised. Bobby, you've got a completely different trajectory, I suppose, in the industry to Henry.
I feel like a total fraud here today as somebody who's so unqualified in radio that I'm almost embarrassed to be here, because I suppose transition into radio came out of, I had done some television. I did 4 years in Dragon's Den, and after the second year, I was asked would I consider doing a radio show, a business show, and
just to bring it back, Bobby, how did you get into Dragon's Den to start with? Was this because of your business career?
Yeah, because my business career had been relatively successful, and I had. They reckoned maybe that I was somebody who would tell a good story, and the thing about Dragon's Den was that they really didn't care how much was invested or how good the business was. It's an entertainment show. Yeah. So really, if you performed...
Did you catch on to that early on,
pretty
Bobby,
much.
that it was entertainment rather than...
I did. I actually did, and that was why I used to go into it all very lightheartedly. I used to like to joke around, come in with one-liners, try and get people to laugh, try and get people to cry, because that was what made the thing the success that it was. So my transition into radio was only out of that. Somebody said to me, would I be interested? Frank Cronin asked me, would I be interested in giving a business show a go? At 9 o'clock on a Sunday morning, I think there was about 15,000 people listening to it at that time.
It's much more now, Bobby.
Well, I know, but there was and Henry said it, it's about sort of grunt work. It was about getting in there, going for the unsocial shift, and just trying to make it better and better. And I did all the stuff in the early days myself. I used to go out and do all my own recordings, and I worked, because I felt, I suppose, inadequate in the space. I reckon I worked harder than the other guys in relation to trying to cover over the cracks that were obviously there. If I listen back to some of the early stuff that I do now, I just absolutely cringe.
But just for the students who are here today, some of them, this is their first day broadcasting on Griff-fm. There was other students who broadcast over the weekend. Speak about that sense of nerves before you go on air for the first time, or those first couple of weeks, particularly for you, Bobby, because you wouldn't even have the college training, you wouldn't have gone through the sort
Yeah,
of things
no,
the
and
students
again,
hear about you?
I did business in DIT back in, the early 80s, so that was a long, long time ago. So, and I actually did a course with Terry Prone, believe it or not, the week before I went on air. She held a kind of a mock radio show up in her place in Pembroke Road or Northumberland Road.
Just explain, Terry Prone is a
Terry
PR
Prone,
specialist.
she's from the communications clinic, big former RTE personality, and has a huge business around communications. But she does some training in radio, and I went up and she set up this radio show. She got all the guests, and I had to interview all these people up in this office, and it was a kind of a live show. And one of the guys that she got to do it was the Minister for Children, James Riley. And he came in, and I actually did an interview with him, and I didn't know who he was, what or what his whole thing was, and we got through it. And then the fear, John, that I had of going on air that first day, and my sister said to me, you could actually hear the terror in my voice that first day out, that there was that echo or that sort of quiver that's in somebody's voice when they're very nervous. She said, I can hear the terror in your voice when you're speaking. And so then I just kept going, and I kept trying to make it better. And I found that the more I prepped the scripts, the more I was on top of the briefs, the more that I had sort of left, the less I left for chance, the actual better that it got.
And this is a point that I'll put around to the whole panel, and Gavin, you can come in on this as well. Preparation is a huge thing in radio, and I suppose some of the best radio is the one that doesn't seem to be prepared from the outside, but hours of preparation have got into it.
But even if you go somewhere else on something that you haven't prepped, the preparation gives you the actual confidence to say, I'm over this brief. So once you're over it, then it can go anyway. And then you can always go back to what you've studied or what you've prepared for. But if you just have, it gives you the confidence to explore, I suppose, bilaterally, a different place in the interview.
Wouldn't it be true to say that a lot of presenters, they have that, the briefs that are there, they're the backup, just in case there's a brain freeze or anything. An awful lot of material that you hear on air is off the cuff. It comes out of the presenter's intellect or what they've already read and the preparation they've done.
I think everybody has their own style.
A brief can often be there as a crutch, just in case things go wrong. Gavin, on that point, preparation is a huge thing, but particularly because you're on Morning Ireland, that means there's an awful lot of breaking news is happening and rolling news in the morning. But for our students, preparation would be a major thing for you?
It is. I mean, the programme is it's unusual in the sense that it almost has 24-hour staff, that while I might simply be in the office in the morning for the preparation before the programme and on air and meetings afterwards, that there are staff, reporters, producers who will come in the morning, who will come in the afternoon, who will come in for an evening shift. It could be 2 or 3 in the morning before they leave, and then one of us is in at 4 or 4:30 to start the morning shift. So there are
for a 7 o'clock show, you're in at about 4 o'clock in the morning?
I'm in a little later than that. I'm in about 5. I'm up at 4, in at 5.
Right.
But there's just people preparing the programme essentially all day. And yet, having said that, if news was to break either before the programme or during the programme,
it can be rip up the run
that
order.
24 hours of preparation has just disappeared.
Yeah.
On the quieter days, there would perhaps be more preparation because the items would be lined up to some extent. There would have been a briefing taken by a producer or a reporter the night before, so you'll have notes available on whoever you're interviewing. But in terms of the direction that you go with the interview, the questions that you ask, that is all down to you. Now, whether you prepare that to some extent the night before, if you have an indication of who you're going to be talking to, it'll usually be in the hour before the programme, or often when it's a two-handed programme like Morning Ireland is, or like Breakfast is on Newstalk, it'll be while the other person's doing their item, you'll be preparing your next item.
Okay, so we've heard some of the backgrounds of 2 of our panellists. So Gavin, as I introduced you, Dr. Gavin Jennings, you came a different route again. You were in the medical profession and you moved into broadcasting.
I did, although my route is quite similar to the route that I would imagine many people here would hope to take into radio, and that essentially, I'll put medicine to one side for a second. My career in radio started in student radio. I worked at Flirt FM, which was the college radio station in Galway, and we were fortunate, very fortunate, in that we had a year-round licence to broadcast about 5 or 6 hours a day, every day.
Flirt is a huge undertaking, really, isn't it?
It was, with
facilities. I've seen your facilities here last year, which they were enviable compared to what we had at the time. I was back there recently, and they have running water in a bathroom, which would have been a very nice thing to have in
Pure
the mid-90s.
luxury.
Yes. But the biggest luxury we had was that we had 5 hours a day to broadcast. And that when I went in initially as a volunteer, as part of a student work job, and realised that I liked what I was doing, the joy of being able to go in there and fill in on shows, which, because there was so much airtime, often there was nobody to do it, or people would be sick, or there was shows to be done. And
were you doing regular shows, like a week? How many would you work on a week?
Yeah, I would have been down to do 1 hour a week, but there would have been many who, if they were so inclined, who would tune in and realise that I was pretty much on all day.
Okay, so
day.
So after Flirt, then what happened? What was the next move?
After Flirt, I was studying medicine in Galway at the time, so I had pretty much decided once I had finished studying medicine that I was going to do a year of practice, which would allow me to come out of practice and work part-time and look for work in journalism. I was determined that I would give 2 years of an experiment, see if I could get work in radio. Bear in mind, I'd no qualifications in journalism. I'd worked in student radio, but my qualifications were in medicine. So I worked full-time in medicine for a year, and then
just for 1 year?
Just for 1 year.
Yeah.
That allowed me to register and do part-time work, locum work.
Yeah.
I applied for lots of jobs. I have a folder somewhere in my mother's house of PFOs about that high, because essentially I had no qualifications. And then one editor of a newspaper in Belfast, who had been a guest I'd had on a college radio programme, said he'd take me in for a few weeks. He was stuck in the run-up to an election. He needed help. There was no mention about me being paid, but we'll get around to that.
Yeah, that sounds like the industry, all right.
I stayed for 6 months. I got part-time work in the BBC. I stayed there for 2 years, and then I went on to RTE. I've been there 11 years since. I never went back to medicine, as you can probably gather.
Okay, and it was a big change. Was it the fact that by working on Flirt FM, you picked up the radio bug? Was that it? You realised that, okay, maybe at first you thought your vocation was medicine. I know people mention vocations and media doesn't usually come up on the list, but is it a case it's a sense of a vocation that you really get caught by the bug of working in media?
I loved doing it. I had done little bits and pieces of journalism before when I was in secondary school. I couldn't get on a school football team, so it was suggested that I write about it for a local paper instead, and I thought, after about a year into this, I realised that I don't need to play football. I'm getting to go to games, go to the dressing room, write about it, and I'm getting all I want out of doing that. To be honest, I never thought that could be a job. I just thought this was a hobby. And the same way in college radio, it took a while to dawn on me that, that maybe I could make a living out of this, that maybe, not much of a living perhaps, but that if I could get a job doing something that I thought I was good at, something that I enjoyed doing, and more to the point, something that I realised that I was giving almost every hour of the day to without any financial reward, and I didn't mind. I liked doing it, and I think if you can find something in life, whether it be art or sport or anything like that, you're willing to give of your time for nothing, then I think you found your job.
So what was your career trajectory in RTE? You were newsreading at one stage?
I joined RTE. I had been at BBC in Belfast and Derry, Radio Ulster and Radio Foyle. So when I came to RTE, I was initially working as a reporter on the News at One programme presented by Sean O'Rourke. Bernadette was my editor, and this is often how, I suppose you could call it fortune, I wanted to present the programme. I was absolutely confident that I could present the programme and any programme that came along, and I wasn't willing to be patient and wait my turn, so I was banging on the door of my senior editor as much as possible, and Bernadette believed that I was capable of doing it and gave me the chance to do it at every available opportunity, so that I essentially became Sean O'Rourke's stand-in whenever he took a break. And he... Oh, thank you.
You often tell them the story, it's nothing to do with the radio, but about your medical. I remember you told me one day that you were given during that, this is like 1 year.
Oh, that's right.
You taught how to stitch somebody up. He was given an orange, bring home to peel and practice on it.
It's the kind of, I suppose it's the example of the confidence you can get from having done a job which is, to some extent, life and death, and then going into a job which isn't. That I took on I needed some locum work, and I had, you don't train to work in A&E, you just simply go from a year in hospitals to taking a 6-month job in A&E, but I wasn't taking 6-month jobs. I was just looking for 2 or 3 days here and there. So I went into A&E in Belfast, and I was told you're going to be on Friday night, so you can have a few hours to see how the lie of the land works. And I pointed out to them, I've never sutured before. I've never had a needle in my hand. I never, I don't know how to sew clothes. We were never taught this in college. What do I do if somebody comes in? And they said, okay, here's an orange and a suture. Go home, take your glasses off so that you find it difficult to do, and practice, and then come in and you'll be grand on Friday night.
Okay. So the move, that's a big transition from going from there to
I should point out the first person that I got in who needed stitching had tried to get into a concert in Belfast without paying, and they'd caught themselves on barbed wire. If you're a man, start crossing your legs. They caught themselves while trying to get one leg over. I didn't have to do the suturing. I passed them on to plastics.
I was lucky enough, yeah. So the move to Morning Ireland, when did that come about?
I was working on the News at 1 between that and a Sunday programme this week for about 7 years. I've been on Morning Ireland for nearly 5 years now. There had been a few departures and retirements in the programme. I was just asked to fill in initially, and one person was sick actually at the time. I was asked to fill in for them, and then when they came back from their sickness, it was suggested that perhaps I should go back to the Sunday programme. I didn't want to go back, so I've kind of stayed there ever since.
So the power of persuasion, yeah?
Something like that.
Okay, so we'll open up the discussion, and feel free to all contribute. Tomorrow we're most likely going to see the dissolution of the Dáil, which will be a huge story for the next couple of weeks, and we're probably looking at the 25th, 26th, Gavin, for the general election to be held.
So, yes.
Most likely the indications are at this stage, yeah. An election is unlike any other type of broadcast, really and truly, because it is huge, and the amount of work that has to go into it is massive. And a lot of the students from here in the college are actually going to be working as reporters' aides during the general election for Newstalk. But just to go around the table, what are the plans in Newstalk and in RTE to be able to deal with something as massive as a general election? I'm sure you all are going to be doing different, you'll have different roles, or your shows will have different responsibilities in relation to the general election. Henry, if I start with you, you're working on Moncrieff, and you've got your own show Under the Covers. You also do work for breakfast, so you're going to be running all over the place.
There is a lot of plans, and sometimes, as Gavin pointed out, you can have lots of plans, and then when the election is finally called, like I heard from a politician that the election's actually going to be called on Thursday, and it'll be a Friday election, but we don't know. It could be tomorrow. And I like RTE probably has a lot of plans. I'm sure Bobby has a lot of plans too. But I am working on a project which is taking up lots of my time. And
You're not running in Carlow and Kilkenny this time, Henry,
no, in 2007 I did a thing called Vote McKean. Don't be mean, vote McKean. McKean is my second name. And I was a fake candidate in Carlow Kilkenny in the constituency, and we even got Foster and Allen to do an election song.
Yeah, it was dreadful.
I canvassed. It was terrible. But it really captured the imagination of a lot of people. Even 9 years on, people still sometimes come up to me and say, "Don't be mean, vote McKean." So we did something.
Well, I'm covering Carlow Kilkenny this time, so I'll keep a look at the spoil votes and see if there's any of your names on it.
But that was good fun. And then 5 years ago, Fionnuala Kenny, Enda Kenny's wife, I bumped into her at a train station in Castlebar. Where else would it have been? Castlebar. And I was in Castlebar, and I asked her, out of nowhere, I just said, "What sort of underpants does Enda Kenny wear?" And she said, "Calvin Klein's." So the next day, the tabloids had Marky Mark, or Mark Wahlberg, but with Enda's head in Calvin Klein's, and it made all the papers, and it was just one of those off-the-cuff remarks that had nothing to do with the election. But so you are looking for those moments, wherever they might come. So I'll be busy with a project which I'm working on at the moment. We'll see how that goes. It might work, it might not. But I definitely think the election magic happens. We don't know where it's going to happen. This time it could happen on Morning Ireland. More than likely it's going to happen on social media. Someone's going to do something or say something which could change the election. All the pollsters are saying, Fine Gael and Labour won't get a majority, but it'll be close, and will it be down to the independents? I'm no expert on politics, like maybe Bobby or Gavin or you.
No, I'm not
but I would say, and it's interesting that you cover an election, and Right, Newstalk did run a course recently, which I missed, on elections. They keep sending us on all these training courses, which I need to go on. But there is a buzz around the election. There is a lot of buzz. And also now, newstalk.com, the resources being put behind the website are huge. Like RTE.ie, they're there. We're not there yet with our website, but maybe one of these days we will be. And it's an opportunity to try and show that we can do radio, we can do online, and we can do TV. And hopefully it is a successful election for the station. And you know, it's about characters, it's about the voters. I personally think that.
Well, that's what you'll be doing. You'll be capturing stories on the ground with real people.
I'm going to Clonmel tomorrow to meet Matty McGrath, for instance. So don't book him a morning on it. So we'll see how that goes. So every day, you know, there's even competitiveness, not just within radio stations, but within the building. You would have the Pat Kenny show, for example, putting pressure on other programs for a guest. I know that kind of stuff might happen on RTE.
I thought you were all one big team there.
Well, I thought we were one happy family.
Yeah, right.
But and that's the thing. Like, I'm looking around the room at the students here, and use this election and go out there and have fun. And I'm sure there's been fights already between different programs and issues and personalities. And there's some, like, I'm noticing these two smiling. Who had the fight? Was it you and the Green? Was it? But you know, and that does happen. But that's good. It's good to have fights and to lose sleep and to work hard, because it's all creativity, and it's trying at the end of the day to try and make some radio magic and have fun. And remember I picked up griff-fm on 106.8 outside the Port Tunnel there on Saturday, but then I lost it again. So people around this area are listening. So
107.8.
Thank you. What did I say? I knew it was the last of the dial. It was way down the end. And like literally,
we're just past you
before
on
RTE.
Newstalk.
Literally seconds before RTE. 107.8. Thank you for correcting me. Whew, that was a bit of a faux pas.
It's okay.
It?
It's okay.
But yeah, no, the election's going to be exciting, and I wasn't excited about it at all up until last week, when the office forced me to get into my car and drive to rural Ireland and face it head on, and I've done that.
And as a reporter, Henry, you travel an amount every year. You're up and down the country.
I used to drive.
A lot.
I used to come from a different area every day, but not so much now.
Not so much now.
Now,
but for the election, you will be.
Yeah, like I was in North Kerry on Friday. Today I'm here. Tomorrow I'm in Clonmel in Tipperary. But most of the time, like we used to send me everywhere, but now I'm mainly, you know, in Dublin, and then it's also about working smart, because you can work really, really hard for what? For very little returns. Like there are times when, give an example, I went over to Las Vegas for the Conor McGregor fight, but then Conor McGregor's people were being difficult, so I just said, I'm going to use bad language. Well, affect this. I'm going to go to a brothel in Nevada. So I was so frustrated with the Connor's people.
You were so frustrated, so you went to a brothel.
Oh, stop. But anyway, and then I spent 250. It was professional. $250 on a cab to get to the brothel. Because I've always wanted to go
that went on the expense account, yeah?
I always wanted to go to a Nevada brothel. It was on my list, my bucket list of things.
Wow.
I don't know. I just thought because it's legal. It's legal prostitution, and I always found that fascinating, and I always wanted to go. So I was like, I'm doing this. I've got a 3-hour window. Conor McGregor won't be fighting until about 10 o'clock at night. So I got the taxi. I got this Ethiopian driver, who was the only driver who agreed to take me. And we drove for 2 hours into the desert, and we met the girls, and they were fantastic. You know, I came back with the material, went to the 13-second fight, did all that, got on a plane, I came back to Ireland, and then, like, it was, my point is, that report, the brothel report, was 8 minutes long, but it probably took about 24 hours getting there and getting back. And my point is, sometimes it's worth it, like that was worth the effort, and other times you would bust your balls doing something, and it might not even make it to air, or it gets squashed, or there's a legal problem with it, or whatever, and that can be frustrating, but you just, it's onwards and upwards, Bobby, isn't it?
Yeah.
You got to just try and, like, there are moments where you just go, oh, but you just got to, there's always tomorrow, we're in this for the long haul, even though I'm still working in the same radio station. I've been there now 14 years this June. And, you know, I did nearly leave during the boom. I nearly left. I nearly joined TV3 last November. But I stayed, and I don't know why I have loyalty to Newstalk, because I don't think Newstalk has loyalty to me, but I have been loyal to the station. And, you know,
you're washing all your dirty linen here today.
It's been a ride. Not like that.
Bobby, I don't know if you have the kind of perks of Henry and his Nevada brothel working on Down to Business, do you?
Well, I just you talked about the election there. Again, it's not my space of expertise, but
you will be involved.
no, I'm going to Waterford,
Yeah.
and I'm going to do the count in Waterford. I'm just doing, and I put my hand up to do it because again, I said, well, I may as well be part of this.
You're going to report from Waterford?
Yeah, I am. Yeah,
Very good. Very good.
So I'm going to go down and because I'd be a firm believer in that. You know, I could easily take the Saturday off or whatever.
But this is you challenging yourself again, then, Bobby, isn't it?
because
And that's what it's all about.
And I'll swat up on what I have to do. I'll make sure I have the, you know, and I'll make sure that it goes off okay.
Okay, and can we just speak about the fact that you have your own programme that's on once a week, but you pop up in other spots around the schedule in Newstalk. So the fact is, you're not just insular within your own programme. Nowadays, presenters and reporters, they are dipping in and out of lots of different programmes.
Yeah. And again, you tend to find that, again, whether it's a parochial thing or a political thing, you tend to find that certain shows like you more than others. In other words, that if you're on breakfast, they don't like you on drive time, or vice versa. And
Or if you fall out with the presenter.
well, you know, so
we won't go into that.
you find that your level of people using it tends to be, and again, I try and get on with everybody. I don't really care because, again, I'm fortunate enough that I'm in radio probably for a different reason. I don't need it to put, and I don't say this flippantly, but it isn't there for me to put bread on the table or to put the kids through college. I have other income that covers that, so I'm in radio purely for the love of it.
So it's the love and the passion of radio.
So I don't, and I'm very fortunate not to have that sort of pressure that if I don't want to do something or not appear on a particular show because I don't like the guy, I just say I'm not doing it.
Gavin, that adaptability is a big issue in the media. You have to be able to turn your hand to whatever opportunity arises, I suppose. And this is the thing, you kind of alluded to it a few times when you were speaking. It's being there, the right person in the right place at the right time. When somebody drops out of a team or they're sick and you fill in, and then you're the one who takes the ball, runs with it, and does so well while filling that gap, that you get the opportunity to advance in the media. But it is about taking your chance when you get it.
It's about confidence as well, and a confidence that, without wishing to harbour the point, that most of that came from college radio. That it's hard to fathom that, even though there are 400,000 plus people listening to Morning Ireland in the morning, that presenting the programme doesn't feel any different to the way it felt presenting a college radio programme. I'm still looking at 2 or 3 people in a gallery. I can't see the listeners. The fact that there was maybe one taxi driver listening in Galway all those years ago, and now there are however many listening in the morning. I can't see them. I was listening to a lot of Terry Wogan over the last day or two.
I was just about to mention,
who spoke about, and other people had spoke of him, saying that when he broadcast to whatever it was, 8 million people in the morning, as far as he was concerned, he was just talking to one person, which for each person who is listening, it's just them they're talking to. So it doesn't feel any different when you can't see the audience. To be honest, the fact that I can see however many people are here now is arguably an awful lot more nerve-wracking than being on radio when you can't see people.
But that's what radio is all about, isn't it? That's the strength of radio, because the perception was the radio would die away and we'd have all different methods of getting our news supply and so forth. But radio, 83% of people listen to radio on a daily basis. It's that intimacy that makes radio such a powerful medium still, isn't it? It
is. I think the one advantage we have over every other media, whether it be newspapers, television, or every other form of media that requires you to stop what you're doing and look at them. You don't have to do that with radio. You can carry on washing the dishes, driving, ironing, gardening, arguing with the dog, your kids. You can do all of those things and still listen to the radio. You can't do that with the screen. Every form of media that's available through this, I have to stop, whether it be hanging around a lamppost in the street to look at a text. With radio, I can get on with it. I think that possibly is the one advantage that we have over other media. Now, there are variations on that. You're going to hear from Eoin McDevitt later, who is involved in perhaps the more modern form of radio in the form of podcasts, which is even more intimate again, because instead of flicking on the radio in the kitchen or in the car and not having any choice but the fact that I'm on RTE in the morning, you choose to take a podcast with you. It's an even more intimate relationship again. You've chosen, if you downloaded Second Captains, as I did on the bus on the way down, to bring Eoin McDevitt with you on the bus. It's a more intimate choice again. But the point is, I can still get on the bus and do all those things and listen to a podcast in a way that I can't really do with a screen device.
Okay, we're going to wrap up now in just a few moments, and I'm going to take a short break, and then Eoin McDevitt will be with us to speak about Second Captains and the other projects that he's working on. But the future of the industry, just to wrap up this section, what do you think the future of the industry is? Because it's now multi-platform, multi-format, and the buzzword being digital, and everything's going digital. Tell us a little bit about what the future of the industry is, in your opinions.
Yeah, well, again, from where I sit, I can see even in the number of years that I've been there, the transition, like the importance now of the podcasts, the importance of the digital coming up, the importance of our activity on Twitter as we're broadcasting.
And can I just say, Bobby, that you probably have the slickest digital podcasting, all the rest, with your programme than a lot of programmes. A lot of programmes are still a little bit slow to get all of that material out. You're very good at it.
Well, I've seen the effects of it, and I've seen that the way we've accrued listeners is by, I think one of the reasons that we were successful in growing the numbers as much as we did was around those platforms.
Because you time it, like you send stuff out as it goes out. And more than any other program, it's really targeted.
And again, you can really see it on a Saturday morning particularly, and then all through the weekend thereafter that, it's a big long tail that there's still comment on Sunday afternoon, on Monday morning.
But isn't this the thing? Everything needs to be there immediately now. So turning podcasts around, there's no point turning your podcast around a week later.
No.
It needs to happen as nearly as soon as your item is off air.
Well, it's the customer expectation, and let's put it in that term, is that's almost an expectation now, is that when you're finished the broadcast, the live broadcast, that all your podcasts should be ready to go.
I'm the heavy podcast user. I mean, I spend whatever time I'm not on air listening to increasingly less live material. The difference would be news programs, but particularly I listen to a lot of sports analysis, and a lot of that would be podcastable. And there's nothing more infuriating than an hour after show if you wanted to listen back to it if it's not being there, and you might check a second time, but
you won't go back again. You're not
going to do it a third time, and you'll after a while you'll know who's there and who's not there. There's a particular form of intimacy with the podcast. It's almost ramped up again from radio. I said it's that matter of choice. It's quite a self-selecting audience to some extent. It's a digital audience. It's one that perhaps on programs like Morning Hour, not that we were very early doing it, but in terms of trying to see what its usefulness is to the program, it's taking a while, because a lot of what we do is to some extent quite disposable. There's an element of, did you hear that on Morning Hour? And if you didn't, you can listen back to it. But by midday, by 1 o'clock, by 2 o'clock, by 3 o'clock, it is quite redundant in the way that some other programs aren't. So it is of value to us, but it's more limited than it would be for some other programs.
But isn't the point that listeners want their radio segmented now, because there might be something on Bobby's program or on your program, Gavin, and they say, okay, I want to hear that item that was on at 7:20, but I don't want to have to trawl through 2 hours of material to get to that point, or to search through for it. People want it there, packaged and ready for them.
It is, although I remember my sister, for example, who lives in Australia, and I've heard this experience particularly for people who either use podcasts when they're walking or in the gym, that they don't want short podcasts. They actually quite like long form, and which is unusual, because a lot of what we do, for example, are 5-minute items. A lot of what you might listen back to might be in short form, but that often people who heavily use podcasts want the long form to take in a half hour, an hour long walk, or a half hour, an hour in the gym. Now, there may be particular niche audiences, and that sometimes I've heard the complaint from our programme that it's too annoying having 20 items come into your inbox. They preferred when it was the whole programme, or it was simply divided into two. It's now each to their own. It's unusual that podcasting can often lend itself to long form, like the way long form newspaper articles look like they were going out, and then suddenly you have a new viewer, a readership for it again.
Finally, Henry, the future of radio in particular, and podcasting and all digital media.
I can see Eoin McDevitt there, and what he's done in recent years I suppose he's ahead of the game, and that is the future. The future is podcasts, and this is how people will get their radio. Even now, if we look around the room, the students would sometimes plug their phones into their car radio. They might not even be listening to live radio, but I still think there is something amazing about live radio, how you could react to things, how there's mistakes, how there's anger, there's laughter, there's tears, and it's live. And I still think that's still a very powerful medium, especially when there's an emergency. For instance, the Paris attacks or something like that. It's still the most instant form of medium, even now.
Okay, we're just about to finish up now, but just a quick word, I suppose, because the students are working in teams. Some of them have only worked in teams once or twice or 3 times before, or whatever it might be. The dynamic of your backroom team, you're all in front of Mike. Tell us just a little bit about the dynamic of the people behind the scenes. Bobby, if you want to start.
Well, we have a fairly tight ship, and again, we are blessed to have students from the likes of colleges like here that will come and work with us.
It's about 3 or 4 in your team, Bobby, is it?
Well, there's me, there's a producer, and we've one shift then for a researcher. So
and there's a techie, but the techie runs through a full shift, but
so
not actually an intrinsic part of your team.
Yeah, so it's tight, and again, I've never minded getting stuck into whatever needs to be done in terms of if there's something that I need to be over. In terms of researching it or going out and whatever.
You're very hands-on. Bobby would get his hands dirty.
But that thing about having a tight team has it means that you can actually you can be fairly productive, because when resources are scarce and the show still has to go on and the show has to go out, I think that we work fairly efficiently.
And Gavin, on the other side, it would be a fairly big team on Morning Ireland. Breakfast talk-based shows often have big teams, don't they?
It's an unusual programme, because I often wouldn't see some of the people who are part of the team because they're working at different times of the day. Whereas when I worked lunchtime with Bernadette, it was 5 or 6 of us, often only 3 of us, on a team where you were all together for a limited amount of time. It was almost restaurant-like. You were preparing a meal and doing it quickly, and to some extent it did work a little bit better because there was a speed about it. Morning Ireland can be there's an element of a juggernaut about it that while it can work very well, it can be a little odd sometimes not seeing the person who might have handed over something to you. There are 4 editors on the programme who will work on any one show, an overall editor and 3 editors in shifts, whereas lunchtime was a bit different. Sometimes the tightness of a team works well, sometimes distance works well as well, because there may be people who simply don't get on with each other, who may not want to see each other.
That's a really good point, like moods. And like, for example, today, just before I came in here, one of the researchers was in a mood, and there's no need for that. And I do think, I'm looking around the room here, like, you've got to get on with each other. You've got to try. We all have our own little ways of doing things.
And Pete Lunn in Newstalk said to me many, many years ago that the relationship between a presenter and their producer is like that of a marriage without the sex. Would that be a
truth?
Especially with John Fardy, I'd have to say that. You're right. Like, if you don't get on, it's. And in my 6 years, I've had 6 different producers, and I got on with every one of them in different ways. Because I made it my business to get on with them. And again, just because I think, if you don't, the show doesn't go on. Okay,
look, we're going to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Henry McKean, Bobby Kerr, Dr. Gavin Jennings. Round of applause, please, for our guests.
Thanks, John.
And you're very welcome back to the second part of our launch of Griff FM. And I'm joined now by Eoin McDevitt of Second Captains. And firstly, we're going to get a quick word from the head of the journalism faculty, Neil Meehan, who joins us now. Neil, thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Just to say what a great opening to Griff FM. It's been one of the best, most interesting and informative, because you've got a great team here with Eoin and earlier Henry McKean, Bobby Kerr and Dr. Gavin Jennings. And I think what Gavin Jennings said is true. Radio is here to stay, because you can listen to radio while you're doing other things. I listen to it when I'm supposed to be at work. Well, actually, when I am at work. And if you think about all the technologies, well, people may not be doing cave paintings anymore, but they are painting. The press is still here, books, newspapers, radio, TV. It's all here to stay, and it's very important that you do as much hard work and enjoyable work as you can in the radio station for the week or so that's in it, and that you get as much out of it as you can, and listen to the people in the industry, listen to their experience, and try and learn from that, and learn from your mistakes. It's the only way to go. So again, thank you very much for the guests who turned up, and thank you very much to the team, John, Bernadette, and Pat and the Radio Griff FM team for organising this opening. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Neil. All right, we're joined now, as I said, by Eoin McDevitt. Eoin, thanks a million for joining us.
Not at all, John. Thanks very much for having me. I should say my stories are a lot less risque than Henry McKean's.
Well,
so I'm sorry in advance for disappointing.
Yeah, well, that's usually the case with Henry.
Yeah.
Can we start off? Where are you originally from, Eoin?
From Kilmacud, around Stillorgan, South County Dublin.
Okay, and then I suppose we'll go up as far as your education. What did you do in college?
In college, I was in UCD, did arts, English and economics in UCD. The English part of it ended up being very useful. The economics, not so much, but maybe that was more of a lack of interest on my part than any issue with the subject. Then I did a master's in DCU in journalism, an MAJ out there. And from there into work experience in Newstalk back about 6 weeks maybe after Newstalk started in 2002. I went in on a work placement there.
Okay, and just mentioning on the master's course you did you get to do practical work on the master's?
A certain amount. Actually, it's interesting. I didn't intend to work in radio at all. I was more into the print side of things, into writing, into that side of it.
Isn't that a big thing that happens to a lot of people in the media industry? They kind of end up in radio kind of by accident.
Well, for me, definitely, yeah.
With aspirations beginning of being a print journalist.
Yeah, well, it's funny. I've got a cousin, Barry Dunn, who I'm sure you know, he works on 98 FM, and he was always going to do radio. I mean, from when he was older than me, but from when he was, when I can remember him, he was always into radio, and that was his career.
And as a teenager, he was on the Pirates. And all the rest,
teenager was working away, so I was. I never even thought about it. I was into sport, really, to be honest, and whatever way I could work in sport was always going to be something that I'd be interested in, and I knew I was never going to be good enough to actually compete at anything. So I thought I'd be writing about it, but yeah, I just started doing radio modules. I don't know if there was a radio station in DCU for us at that time. I don't remember being part of it if there was, but there was a radio module, you know, going out doing projects, that kind of thing. A few packages here and there, and that did actually whet my appetite big time. And really, as it happened, I just got the work placement that appealed to me most and that I was able to get on was in Newstalk. I could have gone into RTE for a couple of months either, but in fairness to the person who interviewed me in RTE, she actually said, listen, you're probably better off going there because you'll get more practical experience there than you will here in a 2-month period.
This is around May 2002?
This is around, around May, June 2002. So the station back then was very rough and ready. It was literally, the place was just being built pretty much, and it was going on air. So there was always more of a chance to get some more meaningful stuff done in a couple of months. Okay,
so you got a 6-week placement in Newstalk at the start, was it?
Probably 8 weeks. I can't quite remember.
Okay, and was that within the sports department?
That was with sport. That was at the very start of the Off the Ball days when Ger Gilroy had started up the sports department there. So I would have been working with the likes of Ger Gilroy and Darragh Whelan researching, but pretty quickly going on to get thrown into on-air stuff, reports, that sort of thing, but also sports bulletins. So I probably spent about a year doing, or near enough a year doing on-air bulletins. And as we heard, this idea of making mistakes, probably making mistakes a lot of the time early on. I would advise people to always keep talking when you're on the radio. One of my first ever bulletins, my headphones, it turned out my headphones are broken, but I thought the microphone wasn't working or we just weren't on air, so I just froze while everybody else was giving me the talking gesture, keep talking, and I just didn't know what to do. So the newsreader who was in control of the faders just went to an ad break, and I was told in no uncertain terms after that, always assume that you're on air and that something else has gone wrong and keep talking.
And it was the case, I think, in and around then, there was a general election, as we were speaking about a general election, and everybody had to muck in, I think, and the lads from the sports department got involved in the election. So even though you were primarily in sport, did you ever find at the start that you were needed to help out in other departments?
Not particularly, because it was just after that, and actually the biggest story in Ireland that year was the Saipan Roy Keane story, which had just happened. So I would have started, probably would have been later June.
Right.
So I would have come in on the back of that, and that was dominating the agenda both in news and sports. So pretty much, even by the time I had started, which was a little bit after that event, just after the World Cup, that was still what everybody was focusing on, which was handy for me, I guess.
So you were on your work placement, then you got paid work as such, as a researcher on Off the Ball?
Probably as a sports bulletin reader. I would have started reading bulletins and then getting shift work on that basis, and gradually that became more full-time a while afterwards.
Okay, and that progressed on from there then. You mentioned Darragh Whelan, who was the first producer on Off the Ball. What was your career trajectory on off the ball? You started as a researcher. What
Started as a
happened after
researcher,
that?
then I went away travelling for a year. In between, I started the bulletins at that stage. Went away travelling for a year, came back, got back onto bulletins, and maybe within about a year coming back, or within 2 years certainly, would have started filling in for Ger Gilroy presenting off the ball when he was away or on holidays, did a bit of stand-in, that kind of thing. That would have been around 2005, say, that sort of time.
And how did that happen by the power of your character, or by knocking down the door, or just by
No, I didn't ask for
natural
it at
selection?
all. No, I didn't really ask for it at all. And to be honest, I was saying about thinking earlier on I was going to write rather than necessarily work in radio. I mean, certainly when I was 15, 16, I wouldn't have thought I would be presenting a radio show or working on TV or anything like that. I wouldn't have felt that confident about it, to be honest. I don't think I was as naturally... I would have had an idea back then that anyone who presents a show or is on air in any way is this super confident kind of person, which I don't think I was. I was okay within myself, but I would have been quiet enough. I wouldn't have been the person out there needing their voices heard at all times. So it wasn't a case of banging the door down, really. It was a case of working away at the jobs that were available at the time. And
So that's the big point about taking opportunities when they
oh,
arise.
completely, yeah. Like, don't have anything set in stone. I wouldn't have thought about... It's good to have a plan, and if you can execute that plan, all the better. But whatever opportunity is there, work away at it, and it should lead to something else. I mean, I think my first experience presenting a show there was a phone-in show after a football phone-in show at, say, 6 o'clock on Saturday, Sunday evenings. Unfortunately, certainly when I was working on it, nobody ever phoned in. So
Which is problematic on a phone.
Which is very problematic, and it's particularly you don't have the experience that I have now, where at least I might be able to blab on about some nonsense for a couple of minutes to whole time. So that's another experience that at the time is horrific, and you're just dying on air. But looking back on it, probably no harm those things happening quite early on in your career and maybe stealing you a little bit to the point that you make mistakes later in your career, or you have a bad show and you can recover rather than freezing on air.
And isn't this the thing about the industry, you know, that those mistakes make you better as a broadcaster because you're very mindful not to make the same mistake the next time?
Yeah, absolutely. And you do make mistakes all the time. You'll ask a stupid question, you'll realise straight away it's stupid. But I think you do get better at compartmentalising that you in your head you're like, okay, I'll kick myself over that when the show is finished, but as long as we're still live, let's just keep the head here, because a lot of the time nobody else has even noticed your mistakes. But they did that time I stopped talking, I'm sure, on air, but by and large you're your own worst critic. So if you can just leave the criticism until afterwards, and by all means then critique yourself, it's always good to listen back, it's always good to pick up on a couple of bits you got wrong, but I certainly think it's not even just okay to make mistakes, it's probably quite important to make mistakes.
So the team that a lot of people would be well aware of is what's now second captains, which is Mark, Simon, Ken, yourself, and Murph.
Yeah.
And that is seen as that was the quintessential off the ball team after Ger moved on to do other projects.
Ger went on
news.
to breakfast at that stage. Yeah, he started presenting. It was Ger, Gilroy, and Claire Byrne, I think, at that stage, presenting breakfast on Newstalk, and that gave us that gave me the chance to start presenting off the ball full time. And the lads had already been working on it at that stage for quite a while as well. But yeah, it was around then that we all started working together and finding our chemistry together.
And that was seen as the quintessential team. That would be my take on it. And I think from lecturing in this area for the last 10 years, people would identify with ye as being the off-the-ball team. And not to plumose you, but massive amounts of awards victories by off the ball during your tenure.
We won a few PPI awards.
Few?
Yeah. Irish people aren't good at self-praise, John. So
yeah, I know that. Okay.
But like we got.
Well, you did. You were very successful. You were probably, I think, the most successful program in awards in the PPIs, or definitely up there.
I think we probably won about 3 best program awards. Well, no, it was actually. Maybe it was more like 5 or something like that. I can't quite remember.
There was a lot of minutes.
No, there was always I think critical acclaim, and it took a while for maybe the listenership figures to reach the sort of levels that the critical acclaim did.
The thing that I often say in lectures is that off the ball is an anomaly in the grand scheme of things. Radio's prime time is 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening. If you look at the listenership figures after 7 o'clock, nobody comes close to what off the ball has had for many years. You seem to have garnered an audience that isn't usually there at night, if that would be fair to say.
I think at 9 o'clock, certainly, when we were there, Ken did his football show from 9 till 10. And I always felt that I couldn't believe people were listening at that stage, because you just logically you do think that the listenership should be ebbing off, but we always found that there was, I don't know even if it's necessarily numbers, but there was certainly a good type of engagement, that people had a certain way of presenting, a certain way of doing things that people reacted to and I think wanted to get involved with. So it was always, I always found it hard to judge. You know, those Jane Allure books come in every quarter, and the whole radio industry has a nervous breakdown nearly every time they come out, and I'm never 100% sure quite how accurately you can gauge these things from one quarter of a year to another. But we always went more by the interaction we were getting with the audience, the type of shows we were putting out, and also how engaged the audience was by it, what sort of text we were getting in, and how, essentially how impactful the radio we were making was on people. And the football show always had that. It sort of stood alone almost from the first 2 hours of the show. The first hour was always quite newsy. It might be more featurey type elements in the second part, and then Ken would come in and it was a football podcast and could end up talking about anything on that, really.
Yeah, no, so as we're talking here, you are mentioning that obviously Off the Ball, it was a sports program, but the skills and the abilities and the experience and all the rest, you know, is general radio experience. It's not exclusive to it being sport. There's no real difference in doing a sports show or doing a current affairs show or light entertainment. It's just you're talking about different topics, that's all. I
think so, yeah. I think you try to be accessible. Sport's a funny one. It's quite easy to fall into sports nerdism, and I think most of us who like sport like it probably too much more than is probably healthy.
More than it's healthy, yeah.
But at the same time, it's not too, I think if you talk about it in an accessible way, and we did, and we get that with our TV show and with our podcast, people who stumbled upon it, it might necessarily be sports fans, generally seem to enjoy it. Now, I don't think they'd be sitting there listening to all 3 hours if they weren't a big sports fan. But there was we certainly tried to make it accessible, and that was more about human relations, the relations between presenters on air. We were genuinely friends and are friends with each other, and I think that came across, and that made it easier for people to get into the conversation, as opposed to maybe being talked down to, as can happen when people cover sport.
Now, the perception among students, going back many, many years, when I've been talking to them about Off the Ball, is that it's all off the cuff, and I was like, no, it's loads of preparation. And I remember from seeing you lads working around the station and watching Ken reading reams and reams of material before he went on air. There is a huge amount of preparation that goes into Off the Ball and Second Captains, but once you're on air, it seems effortless. Would that be a fair way of summing it up?
If it seems effortless, that's great. It never necessarily feels effortless when you're on air, but
it comes across that way.
The tenet of your point, I think, is true. You have to work hard at any of these things in advance, be it podcasts. TV is particularly involved because there's so many people that are involved in the production of a television show, and radio as well, 3 hours a night, whatever it might be. It's going to be, to feel as natural as you can, I think you have to have the work done. If you are going on air a bit worried about not being prepared for one interview, for example, that can affect the rest of the program. That can affect the interactions you have with the other presenters and the way you respond to text. So yeah, certainly I'd always feel you have to work hard to make it feel like it's not hard work.
Yeah, so it's all about massive preparation. So let's move on then to, you left Newstalk, all five on the team that's now Second Captains, which I suppose in a sense, and not to make too big a point out of it, but it did in a sense revolutionise the way podcasts were perceived and received in this country, as Irish Times hosted it and still does.
It still does, yeah. It's funny, since we started working exclusively in podcasts, exclusively in an audio sense, I think the whole podcast landscape worldwide has changed quite a lot. Serial came along and showed that actually this can be not just a niche type of listening experience, but millions of people can listen to a show. You've got the long-form articles that Gavin Jennings talked about earlier, long-form interviews, some of which, the Joe Rogan Experience is one podcast that I listen to occasionally, and he talks to people for 2.5 hours, which there's an argument that's maybe a little bit taking things to too much of an extreme. Barack Obama goes into a guy's shed to talk to Mark Maron in his WTF podcast. It's seen as, there's a lot more credibility attached to podcasts now than there was even probably when we left and started up doing the Irish Times podcast, and certainly from a couple of years before that. Irish people have engaged with radio big time over the years and still do. So I think it was always going to be quite logical that if it's a worldwide phenomenon, Irish people would jump on it. We love listening to stories. We love sport as well. So I think a podcast is just a natural extension of our love of listening to these kind of stories.
Did you feel at the start that this was risky because the whole podcast phenomenon hadn't really taken off when you went to do the podcast on the Irish Times?
Leaving a steady job to try something new is always risky, and certainly there were a few people asking that question of me at the time, I think, but it has worked out really well, and you just have to sometimes jump into it. We were working on the podcast. We were also working very early on the TV. It turned into Second Captains Live, but we were working on ideas around that.
Around the time the podcast started, you were coming up with conceptual ideas for Second Captains Live.
As soon as we were finishing Newstalk, I mean, we had to work, aside from anything else. And
you were on gardening leave for a little while.
We were on gardening leave. I forgot about that. Yeah,
the very disturbing picture of Simon, I think it was, with his shirt off.
Well, he always has his shirt off. It just happened to be in a garden on this particular occasion. But that was a couple of months, and we started in the Irish Times very shortly after that, which was a risk on their part as well, in the sense that they were pretty early in the podcasting stage, and for the first month or two, both of us were really just dipping our toes in. Certainly for the first month, we were just putting out one podcast a week, seeing how it went. But pretty soon, they seemed very happy with it, and they've committed to podcasting big time since then. There's a bunch of new shows that have been launched in the last
they've brought a load on
couple of years, which is really important to us as well. It feels like we're part of something there with the Irish Times, as opposed to just being an afterthought, which podcasting might have been a few years back. That avenue just wouldn't have existed a few years ago. If you wanted to leave a radio station, or if you wanted to try something new in your career,
you have to go to another radio station.
Well, yeah, and certainly podcasting with a newspaper didn't exist a few years ago.
How many do you have a week now on average?
4 a week, yeah.
4 a week, and then if there was a World Cup or a big event?
Well, there's a bonus podcast this week which I can plug. We've got a Six Nations preview out. So it's 5 this week. And during the World Cup, say in 2010, the Soccer World Cup, we would have had one pretty much every day. We certainly would put out extra ones, and we'll be doing that during the Euros as well. Okay,
just a final word then before we finish up, Eoin, and thanks a million for joining us. Second Captains, you never worked on TV before, did you?
I worked
on a regular basis?
Not together. We didn't work as a team together. I had worked on Setanta. I'd worked in a show called I Talk Sport there, which was sort of a sports chat show, but it didn't have the live element it was live actually, but it didn't have the live crowd element that.
But this was the first time the whole team
worked together, yeah. So that was.
So Mark is your producer on Second Captains Live?
Yeah, Mark's the series producer, yeah, and then we've got other producers. It was Simon Hick as well, and Aideen O'Sullivan. We've got other people who come in and work exclusively on the TV show on sort of short term.
And then it's yourself and Murph and Ken
are the presenters on that. Yeah, no, that was So that's another level of stress again when we started piloting that. Not so much once you go on air. When you know you're actually on air, it's okay. But we had to do a couple of shows in advance of that, where you're just having to show RTE that we can do this and that it'll make a certain amount of sense. I remember recording one of those in. Where was it? It was a bar in town anyway, and it's just a matter of recording a live show essentially and sending some stuff in. But it was a particularly hot day, and they had to turn off the air conditioning because it was making noise. So it was a sweaty, nerve-wracking kind of a day, and I didn't know if the footage would even be usable. But we got it sent into them, and they seemed happy enough with it. So that's gone. We were 5 series into that now, so. Obviously, they were happy enough with what they got.
Brilliant, and it's a great show, and the podcast is excellent as well on the Irish Times. Finally, any words for our students, bit of advice if they want to pursue a career in this industry?
Just keep talking, as I said. Seriously, the mistakes thing I think is the biggest thing. And the nerves, I suppose we just touched on it there. Like, it's okay to get nervous about stuff as well.
And that's a positive nervous energy before you go on air as well.
Yeah, completely. I mean, that happens to me, particularly with TV. That would happen to me every time I go on a TV show. Podcast might depend on the interview, but a particularly big interview, you'd be really nervous. And there's times you're thinking, I could have picked a career that doesn't do this to me. But the sense of achievement you get out, the nerves are always a good thing, even if it feels like they're not. So just embrace those and go and do whatever it is. I think Padraig Harrington, I've interviewed him before, and he's talked about this quite a lot, that anything that's worth doing in life, you're going to get a bit nervous about it because it means that it's important to you. So just embrace them, yeah.
Okay. Thank you very much, Eoin McDevitt from Second Captains podcast and Second Captains Live. Folks, show your appreciation for Eoin McDevitt, please.